It's not that long ago that the nations of Europe avidly debated what was called the Jewish question. Students of history know what I am referencing. Already in the middle of the 18th century, the British Parliament was debating whether or not Jews could be tolerated as part of their society. The Jew Bill, as it was called, in 1753 passed, just barely, and after a huge anti-Semitic backlash, it was repealed the next year. It took another 100 years. All over Europe and into the 19th century, this Jewish question raged. As nationalism rose in the 1800s, and many of the nations that we now know first came into being, they all had a version of this same problem. Because at the time, and I would argue still today, nations are generally built upon ethnic contiguity, or some myth thereof, a people, a land, the ties of blood and soil, a faith. Some version of this lies beneath every country that came to being in the 19th century. This was what the myth was. And against this, what was one to do with the Jews? Because wherever you went, it was a group that was not of the same ethnicity, faith, or culture. It was a group that systematically was denied a connection to the land in which they lived, a group that would speak a different language, eat different food, observe different holidays, a group that understood itself to be displaced residents of another land. It was the persistence of the Jewish question, what are we to do with the Jews, that led the Jews of that time to ask a corollary to that Jewish question, what are we to do with ourselves? Knowing who we are, knowing where we originated, can we really wait any longer? There were three main answers that emerged from that self-questioning. The traditionalists said, we can wait. When God wants us to move, the Mashiach, the Messiah, will be sent. Everything will be clear. There will be no doubts. Until then, we're in exile. Mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu. Because of our sins, we were exiled from our land. There were assimilationists who answered the question another way. If difference is the problem, we can just make that disappear. We'll go along to get along. We'll adopt the ways of our neighbors, even their religion. If Jewish identity is what's causing us this problem, let's just give that up. And there were plenty of people who did that. The last answer was rooted in Jewish tradition, but given a big boost from the tenor of the times and the rise of nationalism. And these were the people who said, no, we cannot wait any longer. We are a people. We are a nation, and we need a place. Let's go back to where we came from or choose a new home. We can no longer be the objects of history. We must be its authors. With the terrible accuracy of hindsight, we know how things worked out for each of these groups. The fires of the Second World War consumed millions of our people. The traditionalists who chose to stay put and rejected a move to the New World or Palestine were caught in the flames. Those who thought their assimilation would protect them found out that it was their blood, not their faith, that could not be tolerated by those around them. And they too were caught in the flames. Those who, like the vast majority of humanity at any given time, simply could not imagine another life, they too were caught in the flames. The fascist murderers who spoke of and implemented their final solution, in fact, had created their own demonic answer to the Jewish question. Those we know who came to the New World survived, and we, their descendants, came to thrive. The earliest large group of Jews coming to these shores was in the 1830s and 1840s. These were our ancestors who built lives, businesses, congregations. These were the founders of the UAHC, the American Union of American Hebrew Congregations, which we are still a part of, and HUC, the Hebrew Union College, to train American rabbis for American congregations. Later groups came from Eastern Europe about 50 years later, All of them were fleeing impossible conditions. The Jewish question of Europe meant restricted movement, internal passports for Jews to move from one town to another, paying special taxes, no possibility of citizenship or even civic equality before the law, being forced to swear a special oath before you could testify in a court. Those who went to Palestine, starting in the 19th century, built the country we now call Israel. We celebrate 75 years of Israel's birth in our 5783 year. We have much to celebrate, but I feel it critical to remember the years that preceded the founding of the state. The Zionist movement has a history, it has a grounding. Israel did not spring out of the ashes of World War II. Israel was not handed to the Jewish people. It was a product of toil and blood, and it was built stone by stone, field by field, tree by tree, street by street. Dedicated people who could see the reality of the dream before their eyes and already knew in their hearts and souls, Ein li eretz acheret, I have no other land. There is no other place to go. It was a dream of thousands of years made real. Israel, voted into existence by the early United Nations in 1947 and proclaimed independent in 1948. In a matter of months, the Jewish people re-entered history. At the time, it was already the home to nearly 1 million Jews. Now, we Americans have a particular view of the world, no less so than American Jews. All it takes is for us to read a little or watch a little bit of news from foreign sources to get the picture. I intend no malice, but as Americans, we tend to see the world revolving around us and our concerns. We're notorious for knowing little about other countries, unless, of course, we're in a conflict with them, and then we become experts. Certainly, it's a product of the sheer size of our nation, our population, our sheltering oceans, the tremendous strength that we have built in our economic realm, our cultural realm, and of course, our unquestioned military might. All of this informs the way we relate to people around the world, but it can be hard for us when others don't see us as we see ourselves. It can be a shot across the face when we realize that our allies will take our advice, but not our orders. Believe it or not every person in the world wakes up in the morning and thinks, I wonder what's going on in the U.S. today. But as American Jews, we have also long had a history of seeing ourselves as the benefactors of our Israeli sisters and brothers. We're the lucky ones, we're secure, we're prosperous, and our wealth was needed to help build that country up. But I think this view is partly from an imperfect understanding of our own history in America. For you see, citizenship was never a sure thing for Jews in the United States. The first group that came here was in 1654 to New Amsterdam. The governor of that Dutch colony, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to ban them from the colony, and it was over his great objection that the Dutch West Indies Company overruled him. Even after the American Revolution, which we had participated in, we were insecure. 1790, 14 years after the Declaration of Independence, Washington wrote a letter to the concerned Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, the Touro Synagogue. They were descendants of that very same group that had arrived in New Amsterdam the previous century. It was then that Washington assured them that they would have civic equality in the new country. It was never a given. When the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, was founded in 1873, it was founded without the word Jew or Jewish or Israel anywhere in the title. Our outward-facing goal was to make ourselves as assimilated as possible to avoid trouble, because we were that tenuous. We were referred to as Hebrews, or of the Mosaic persuasion. Anything was better than saying Jew. Friday night services became the big part of Reform worship. Why? Because everybody was going to work on Saturday, because that's what you did in America. All that separated us from our neighbors was our religion. Otherwise, we're exactly the same. And that was the drumbeat that came over and over again. But we have seen anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head in our day. It's not a new thing in the United States. If anything, we are seeing something of a return to a cultural norm. I hope that we're able to overcome it. But all of us know the stories. All of us have experienced it or had relatives who did. The restricted admissions, the refusals to hire, the neighborhoods you couldn't live in, the hotels you couldn't stay in. It's just not that long ago that our families were changing their names so we could not be recognizably Jewish. If you had asked, pardon me, we don't really know the full story of America's Jews yet, because frankly, we haven't been here long enough or in large enough numbers to know the end of it. If you had asked Poland's Jews how life was in the year 1500, 160 years after they had arrived, they would have said, "Wow, is Poland great! Look at those poor Jews in Spain and Portugal that are running for their lives, expelled. The Polish people accept us. We have legal equality here for a century already, and King Casimir reaffirmed it. They like us. We're growing prosperous. We have a place in Polish society." Well, 150 years later, pogroms and riots killed 100,000 Polish Jews. And we know how their story ended. No one today is banking on a Jewish future in Poland. Who can say where we in America will be in another 160 years? It's the blink of an eye in Jewish history. It's enough to say the world does not revolve around America, and the Jewish world does not revolve around the American Jewish community. Israel was brought into being in full knowledge of our entire history, not just the narrow slice of our most recent past in any one country. The historic forces that came together for the first World Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, in Switzerland, were rooted in that prior Jewish history, knowing full well the prior times of security and expulsion, the long years of wandering and longing, and certainly the Jewish question that was being forced upon them in the 19th century. So this is the year we celebrate Israel's 75th birthday. The first notable date will be on November 29th. That is the anniversary of that UN vote that took what was then the British Mandate of Palestine and broke it into 3 zones, one called Israel, one called Palestine, and an internationally administered city of Jerusalem. The UN was a brand new institution, cleaning up messes from the League of Nations and the horrific aftermath of the Second World War, trying to establish a new rights-based international order to provide a forum to settle conflicts without violence. The vote that day was far from a sure thing. Diplomats and Israeli emissaries were assigned to every nation's delegation that had the potential for a positive vote. In the end, it was 33-13 in favor, with 10 abstentions. The euphoria across the Jewish world and in the streets of the new nation was unbounded. It was also immediately met by war from the nations all around. The next great date in this year of 5783 is May 14th, or the 5th of Iyar, depending on how you count, because it was then that the Israeli state declared its own independence. Any Jew alive then can tell you where they were and how they felt. The Israeli flag was raised in the DP camps of Europe. Jews mobbed the streets of American cities. The banner headline across New York Times the next day, in bold type all the way across, "Zionists proclaim new state of Israel. Truman recognizes it and hopes for peace. Tel Aviv is bombed. Egypt orders invasion." And just below the banner, "The Jews rejoice. Some weep as quest for statehood ends." 75 years this year, the longing of millennia was requited. The establishment of Israel was the end of one long journey and the beginning of what is perhaps an even more arduous one. We have often heard it said to be careful for what we wish for, we just might get it. With Israel, of course, came the need to defend it, the need to build the institutions and the infrastructure, to no longer be the object of history, but to bear the awesome burden of being its authors. The best image that I can employ is taken right from the Jewish history of residence in the land of Israel. The first period of such started after the Exodus from Egypt, from the judges to the kings, and then reached its height with King Solomon and the building of the first temple. This whole period is known as First Temple Israel. The ancient society faltered, and it failed for many reasons. Ultimately, it was an insufficient faith. As the rabbis tell us, avodah zarah, the worship of other gods. No true belief in who they were and why they were there. While Solomon still lived, the builder of the temple, shrines were erected to idols all around the hills of Jerusalem. It's there in the book of Kings, folks. Read it. The kingdom split in two and was slowly destroyed. A little more than 400 years after the temple was built, it was leveled. And then came 70 years of Babylonian exile and captivity, and then another try. The second temple was built around the year 500 BCE. The problems of the first temple had been corrected. There was no more idolatry, and the Torah had a resurgence among the people, culminating in what we came to know as Rabbinic Judaism. Well, the Greeks and then the Romans came, but we hung on one way or another, as subjects, as a client state, periods of brief independence, and also living as the province of an empire. That all came to an end in the years 70 and 132, when subsequent revolts against Rome led to the destruction of the Second Temple and then the entire city of Jerusalem. The historical diagnosis of our rabbis is that the undoing of the Second Temple period was a result of sinat chinam, senseless hatred and factionalism. Infighting had left us unable to combat a common enemy. The penalty was much more severe. This time, it was a diaspora that was alleviated only 75 years ago. Each era of Jewish independence is associated with the temple in Jerusalem. I put it to you today that we are living in the era of the Third Temple. It has already been built. It's not a temple that can be seen on the Mount in Jerusalem. I have no desire for a return to sacrificial religion. But you can see it. You'll see it at a street cafe in Tel Aviv. You'll find it at a kindergarten in Beersheba. You'll find it in a world-class hospital in Haifa and an amazing restaurant in Akko. You can hear it reverberating from the bell of a streetcar in Jerusalem and from the church bells in its old city and from the calls of a muezzin in al-Fahim. You can see it in people who drive too fast and argue too much. You can see it in the incredible creativity and inventiveness of the Israelis. The Third Temple already stands, and I know it to be so. For the first time in 2,000 years, there are more Jews in Israel than anywhere else in the world. Think about that. The Jewish population of Israel is half again what ours is here in the United States. It's not just a Jewish homeland, but a home to more Jews than anywhere else. We are a generation that gets to experience a genuine miracle, and we too often remained blind to it. It's as if Moses had been out tending his sheep and said, nice bush, and walked on. From Basel, 125 years ago until today, the miracle has unfolded in slow motion, but 125 years is the blink of an eye in Jewish history. The temple has been rebuilt. We don't need to keep building another one. I know it to be so because just as with the first and second temples, we have our own potentially deadly factor to deal with. It's not idolatry. It's not baseless factionalism, although Israeli politics are pretty rough. It's the possession of great power. Our people have not had such power in a very long time, and learning how to apply it and how not to is our contemporary burden and our contemporary threat. And the failure to resolve this problem could, in the end, be fatal and could cause the fall of the Third Temple. There is a difficult line to draw between what is necessary in proper self-defense and what is heavy-handed in a callous use of deadly force. This is a tough one for us because the struggle between Israel and Palestine is far from over, and it has involved bloodshed for more than a century. I am confident that Israel, at its core, a humane and rights-based society, will find its way. And so my message for you this year is to rejoice in 75 years. We are a generation uniquely blessed to see this come to pass, to live in an age of a miracle realized. We get to witness Hatikva bat shnot alpayim, the hope of 2,000 years, answered. Israel is not perfect. And I say, so what? I don't know of a perfect place in this world. Look, we can't help but see shortcomings. We can't help but see faults. But the focus only on fault is unfair and unreasonable. Could you imagine our ancestors crossing the Red Sea and only complaining, "Ugh, these are new rope sandals. I will never get the mud out of these. They're ruined." So see the miracle. Rejoice in what God has made possible. We are the generation our ancestors prayed for in an unbroken chain of millennia. We answered the Jewish question on our own terms. So let's try and take yes for an answer without hedging and without embarrassment. I'd like to close my comments with a prayer from Rabbi Nachum Waldman for Israel. We pray for Israel, both the mystic ideal of our ancestors' dreams and the living miracle here and now, built of heart, muscle, and steel. May she endure and guard her soul, surviving the relentless age-old hatreds, the cynical concealment of diplomatic deceit, and the rumblings that warn of war. May Israel continue to be the temple that magnetizes the loving eyes of Jews in all corners, the Jew in a land of affluence and relative peace who forgets the glory and pain of being, and the Jew in a land of oppression whose blooded fist beats in anguish and pride against the cage of enslavement. May Israel yet embrace her homeless, her own, and bind the ingathered into one people. May those who yearn for a society built on human concern find the vision of the prophets realized in her. May her readiness to defend never diminish her search for peace. May we always dare to hope that in our day the antagonisms will end, that all the displaced, Arab and Jew, will be rooted again, that within Israel and across her borders, all God's children will touch hands in peace. We say,